So you will recognize the soundtrack, if not the movie, which was just done on Runway a couple of weeks ago, as being from 2001: A Space Odyssey, produced by Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, who's going to be a central figure in this discussion. What I think stands out about this particular movie is, of course, we have a very pejorative or a kind of skeptical view, a kind of technophobic view of technology through HAL 9000, the supercomputer on board that turns against the astronauts. Why exactly it turns against the astronauts? There are many different debates according to whether you read the book or see the movie and so on and so on. But it does turn against the astronauts, as we well know. Less obvious, perhaps, is the opening scene. I mean, the whole movie is very enigmatic, but the opening scene in which there are these monoliths that appear with this kind of primitive tribe of ape-like figures. These are the monoliths, which are not explained in the movie, are explained by Arthur C. Clarke in his book as being sort of devices, communication devices that have been put there by an extraterrestrial intelligent species who are concerned to promote civilization. They found the Earth and they realize that civilization has been held up, and they locate these monoliths. These monoliths in the movie, let me just play a short sort of thing. When they see it, they're not sure what about it. They can't eat it, so they leave it alone. But what it does do is that its presence seems to be a catalyst for them developing inventing the first tool, which is a bone which they attack each other with. So I guess what makes this movie interesting is that it has both a negative and positive attitudes towards technology. Technology can help us and also impede us in some way, and that is very much the view that I take in my work on AI. I can move on. And of course, we all have our own personal devices with us, our own mini monoliths, as it were. And the thing about AI is that it's basically code. It consists of algorithms. It's therefore essentially invisible, immaterial, and we're not even aware half the time that on our phones we have all these AI-driven apps. AI, of course, is what recognizes our friends on Facebook. It's what finishes off our sentences on Gmail. It's what translates on WeChat, and so on and so on and so on. But because it's invisible, it doesn't necessarily appear to us. I should say that the firstborns, the creatures that left those monoliths, also become eventually invisible. They dematerialize and become pure intelligence. So in my book, I make this comment: it's as though the Earth has been invaded by an invisible, super intelligent alien species. And the term alien will feed through what I'm talking about. So anyway, today I want to kind of present this with this lecture, a version of other things I've given before, with a slight twist to it. It's going to be there's a slight theme, a movie theme that threads through it, and also I'm going to explicitly refer to Geoffrey Hinton and a few others. It's not about the technological. If you want to read to see tutorials about this, DigitalFUTURES is a platform that I set up a while back, and we have a lot of tutorials on that. We also have some very interesting, extremely interesting theoretical seminars about neuroscience and AI. Carl Friston, Joshua Bach, Blaise Guiliakos, and so on. Some really brilliant people. And that, I think, is the really interesting area of theoretical debate that's going on right now. And finally, I put my stuff on Instagram. I post whatever I've been doing. But I want to talk about this, and almost it's as though there is a movie going right now, a kind of soap opera, certainly, in Silicon Valley, where Elon Musk is suing Sam Altman and others and so on. In fact, it's almost like the world is stranger than anything we ever saw in the movies. And there's a cast of characters who are part of this. Alan Turing, Marvin Minsky, Geoffrey Hinton, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Ilya Sutskever, Fei-Fei Li, and Denis Hassabis being just some of them. The question is, what are we actually watching? Is it a soap opera? Is it a comedy? Is it a tragedy? Is it an episode of Black Mirror? Or is it a movie with a happy ending? I'm going to present something. I guess it's a bit like a Black Mirror episode, but it does have a happy ending in some senses. So these are the two people I want to start by talking about, because only just over a month ago, Geoffrey Hinton and Denis Hassabis both got Nobel Prizes for their work on AI, although Denis Hassabis had got it actually for contribution to chemistry. What is interesting about these two individuals is that they are totally convinced that about the way forward in terms of AI is through modeling AI on the brain. They're as interested in neuroscience as they are in AI. In fact, Demis Hassabis did a PhD in neuroscience before he went into the world of AI. They're both British. They're both from the University of Cambridge. They're graduates from the University of Cambridge. And I'm also a graduate of the University of Cambridge, also into neuroscience and AI. And of course, I've been checking my email to see if I'm the third recipient of the Nobel Prize, but I jest. But there was another person who was at Cambridge, also completely fascinated by neuroscience and AI, and who never received a Nobel Prize. Alan Turing. He tragically died in 1954 before even the term AI had been coined. And we didn't find out what he'd done until the 1970s, because his work during the war that we now know about through the movies, The Imitation Game, was kept secret under the Official Secrets Act. I always suspected, as someone's brought up in the UK, that maybe he could have been the model for Doctor Who, someone with a PhD, not in medicine, but in science and technology, who saved the world. But technically that wouldn't be the case, because Doctor Who started in the 60s, and Alan Turing's secrets weren't revealed until the 70s. But then Doctor Who's a Time Lord, so maybe that's not the case. But anyway, Alan Turing was another person you can see up here, he referenced here. I'm more interested in the possibility of producing models of the action of the brain than the practical applications of computing today. And it's that interface which I think is incredibly interesting right now. Either if you're working in AI, they're working on neural networks and learning from the brain, as it were, or I would say, if you're interested in theory, now is the time when you can actually, in some ways, learn in the mirror of AI. There is so much to be picked up, I think, about how we operate. Of course, the brain is a black box, and so is a neural network, so you can't really compare them, but there are hints every now and again of some astonishing insights into how the mind works. The term AI was actually not coined until 1955 for an event that took place in 1956 in Dartmouth College in the States, where all the kind of the smartest young minds at the time, and in the middle of the back there we have Marvin Minsky, this is Claude Shannon, got together with an idea of trying to solve the basic problems of AI within 2 years. That was a hopelessly optimistic aim. In fact, in the first 50 years, they achieved almost nothing. They got back, the survivors got back together. If I can lose that. Click on that. Okay, good. The survivors got back together. This is actually John McCarthy who coined the term artificial intelligence. He wasn't very happy with the term, but as he put it, we had to call it something. I don't think it's in any way artificial. It's maybe synthetic. And the big debate going on right now, and I think there's a book coming out by Blaise Igouliakos next year in the spring about intelligence, where he basically says that actually there's ultimately little difference between the biological intelligence and the mechanical intelligence, in the sense that both work. And if something works, that's the key thing, key driver. If a plane can fly, maybe in a very different way in which a bird can fly, it still can fly. It both works. So anyway, the question of intelligence, I think, is right behind all this, and there's a lot of debates going on there. Anyway, when they got back together, and this is Marvin Minsky again here, they had to admit they'd achieved absolutely nothing in the first 50 years, and they predicted that they would achieve nothing in the next 50 years. But by a strange coincidence, 2006, the date of their reunion, was roughly the time that things began to pick up in the world of AI because of some factors I just mentioned briefly. I mean, just to comment at the time, the big ambition, because this was during the Cold War, the big ambition was to be able to translate what the Soviets were saying, to translate Russian. And AI is fantastic now. The Chinese translation of my book is coming out through AI. But in those days, it was totally useless. There were jokes going around that once they tried to translate the expression "out of sight is out of mind," and they got an invisible lunatic. There was a lot of hype about AI, and it wasn't working. And part of the reason was they were backing the wrong horse. There have been 5 different approaches towards AI, which the 2 dominant ones was symbolic AI based on logic, and connectionism based on neural networks. And Piss McCulloch, back in the early days, back in 1943, had been experimenting with neural networks. And but they, largely because of a book that was published by Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert on perceptrons, where he was trashing neural networks and saying they're not working, they're never going to work, neural networks fell out of favor. But around 1999, they invented GPUs, graphic processing units, originally for gaming. But then they discovered they actually made computers much, much faster and much, much more powerful. And then all of a sudden, neural networks took off. And it's largely thanks to, like, a bit, I'm struggling to move the slides forward. Any suggestions on that? I'm just trying to move the slide forward. Right?
Maybe when you press the arrow. So
I am pressing the arrow.
yeah.
Okay, there we go. Okay, it's largely thanks to this guy, Geoffrey Hinton, that we have achieved what we've achieved. Geoffrey Hinton is from a very distinguished British family. His great-great-grandfather was George Boole of Boolean geometry fame, and he studied at the University of Cambridge. In fact, I don't know if you guys know, but he studied architecture for 2 days. And then he decided architecture was not for him. When I put this to my friend Marta Sigari at Foster & Partners, she said, he's smart. It took me 5 years to realize architecture was not for me. But then he moved into natural sciences and eventually did a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. And he was convinced the way to get to AI, to AGI, was through modeling it on the brain. And in a very hostile world where basically he had to scrub every reference to neural networks in all the papers he published in order to get anything published. But he persisted stubbornly. And eventually, once GPUs came along, the neural networks started to work, and they started to work like a dream. So what we have right now is deep learning. Whenever you refer to ChatGPT or Midjourney or DALL-E or whatever it is, it's deep learning. And that's based on neural networks. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning. It's a subset of artificial intelligence, like Russian dolls nested inside each other. But that's really it's a deep learning revolution that has powered these things right now. And the first 50 years, AI failed to deliver, and now it's delivering almost too much, and we're getting a bit paranoid. The Geoffrey Hinton is often referred to as the godfather of AI. He went to the University of Toronto. He joined Google and then he left Google in order to speak out about his concerns. And on the one hand, he'd been responsible for launching deep learning, but then he was very concerned about some of the things that were coming out. Fei-Fei Li, who is originally from China, then studied at Stanford at Princeton. Now she's a professor at Stanford. She could be described as maybe the godmother of AI, and she was interested, first of all, in how we could pursue images in the world of AI. And she was responsible for a series of competitions called ImageNet competitions, where they were competing to see who could recognize an image, first of all. And in 2012, we've all got facial recognition on our cameras, on our phones now. It's nothing special, but we didn't have it in 2012, surprisingly. But anyway, Geoffrey Hinton and his team came along, a team of PhD students, including Ilya Sutskever, who's been quite famous recently because of OpenAI. And they came along with this, what was pretty much an obsolete technology. It was a bit like a steam engine. No one was using neural networks anymore. And they came along and they wiped the floor. They won by a country mile. What's happening here basically is the pixels in the image are being processed through layers of these neural networks. These are neurons, and the lines between them called synapses, and the flow of information from left to right is governed by the weights on the synapses. Now, the hidden layers could be anything up to 5,000, hence the term deep learning. And eventually it will recognize that it's a bird, 99% sure, never 100% sure. Anyway, Hinton won, and everyone was absolutely shocked. The way that Fei-Fei Li describes this, and I think she's exaggerating, is that she says it's as though the world's speed record was beaten by 100 miles an hour by someone driving a Honda Civic. Well, I don't know if that's the case, but the point is, all of a sudden, everything changed, and people said, oh, like walls. I always thought that neural networks were the way forward, and that's when the deep learning revolution began. But the holy grail for computer scientists was not to recognize an image, it was to synthesize an image, to generate an image. And they soon realized there was a Russian engineer working at Google. You simply had to invert the network. And you would just go, instead of going from left to right, you go from right to left. And you could produce this extremely trippy image. This is called Deep Dream. And it's a neural network trained, it seems, on serpents and dogs and oil lamp or something that composes all these things. But they're pose invariant. All information on where they should be has been lost. Anyway, this was the first ever exhibition on AI generated art was based on this, and it was at least a step in the right direction. But then in about 2014-15, Ian Goodfellow came along, and also in Canada, it's University of Montreal doing a PhD, and he was out at a pub one night with his mates and was talking about his idea, and they all got very excited about it. He went back and wrote it up, and that's what gave us the next step, which is called GANs, Generative Adversarial Networks. And the way this works is you get two neural networks. You get a generator here, which is taking random noise and producing an image, and then the discriminator is judging that against a training set. And if it's not good enough, it rejects it. It's a bit like a, if you're teaching students, or the tutor says that's rubbish, go and do it again, kind of thing, and eventually it improves. And this really led to a substantial improvement in terms of the kind of images being produced. Scans are not easy. You've got to be computationally very advanced to use them, and you've got to work extremely hard to get there. And the definition is not that great, but nonetheless, this was a huge breakthrough. These, of course, are all fake people, and that's what really happens with a GAN. There's a site you can go to called "This Person Does Not Exist," where you can generate fake people one after the other as soon as you refresh your browser, and also another one, "This cat does not exist." But this was a major, major breakthrough, and all of a sudden we had something that was looking fairly convincing. But meanwhile, in architecture, we were completely asleep, absolutely, totally asleep. And in 2019, I was working on AI for 2016 or 17, I guess. And in 2019, I put in a proposal to curate the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, teaming up with Zaha Hadid Architects, with Refik Anadol, Refik is now a rock star in the world of media art, with Jane Barry and a few others, and we were sponsored by Google. It was an absolute dream team, and what we want to do is basically to hallucinate not faces but buildings, but we got nowhere. We weren't even shortlisted. And just go to show, 2019, that's not that long ago. Nobody was thinking about AI. But Refik decided that he was going to go ahead anyway and do what we proposed to do. So he got all the images of the work of Zaha Hadid that he could get hold of, trained a cycle GAN on that, and eventually, very laboriously, out of that, an image appears that starts coming out of the computer that is almost recognizable as an image designed by Zaha Hadid, even though Zaha herself had died in 2016. You could take her work and produce something that looks similar. So in a second, what you'll see was, I think, the first ever GAN-generated image to be produced by Refik Anadol, based on the work of Zaha Hadid. And that was an amazing breakthrough in some ways. And I put that on the front cover of my book, the first ever book in English, mainstream book in English on AI and architecture. It came out in December 2021. Everyone had COVID, there was no book launch. After that, there was a whole flurry of other books that came out in the next 6 months about looking at the same thing. It's now coming out in February in the second edition, and there'll be several other editions coming out in different colors, from white to yellow to pink to blue, whatever. And alongside that, there was further experimentation going on looking at cycle GANs. This is the work of Daniel Bolojan for Corp Himmelblau, where he's taking the work of Corp Himmelblau and breeding things against some geological formation. So whereas cycle GANs were simply taking a finite set and averaging, so it was interpolating, this is effectively extrapolating, because you're taking two different data sets and you're effectively breeding them. And this at the time, which is the end of 2021, was probably the best we had in terms of the most of producing something that was looking vaguely architectural. It looks very primitive now, but trust me, in those days it was really quite the state of the art. And that's what we put on the cover of the next book that I produced, which is an AD. And you can see how glitchy it is. It's not, the resolution's not very good, and so on and so on. And that AD came out in, I think, April, I think it was. And like everything else, was out of date within about a few weeks, mainly because of the next development, which was the diffusion model. Diffusion model operates in a very different way. It takes Gaussian noise and it disrupts images and then reverses that process and repairs the image. It works on a pre-trained neural network, so you haven't got to train it, someone else has done it. And it's very quick, it takes a few seconds, and of course it's now based on text to images. This was and what's interesting about this particular one, I mean, AI doesn't copy. People misunderstand it. It picks out features, it does not copy. We copy. My book Camouflage is all about how humans copy, but it doesn't copy. And what was interesting about this particular prompt, an astronaut on a horse, that presumably there'd never been an astronaut on a horse before, but it knows what an astronaut might look like, it knows what a horse might look like, and it basically interpolates, and we get this. This hadn't been released, but we'd seen some examples, and I gave a lecture at the AA in May 2022. And I was saying, when are people going to wake up to this astonishing tool? When are architects going to wake up? And interestingly enough, there was a voice in the audience saying, we already have. And I didn't know this, but Patrick Schumacher was working with Refik Anadol, and they'd been using DALL-E. Refik, because he was famous, was given access to play around with DALL-E, and they produced this, which is definitely a huge improvement on that initial GAN. And then, you know, and then they look 3D, but they're just 2D. And of course, everyone else, we can all do that now. We can all use these things. Midjourney came out in July 2022, and DALL-E also shortly afterwards. And the models have got better and better and better along the way. And these are just examples of things that I've generated using Midjourney, but I'm sure most of you have been doing similar things. Now, what I want to stress is that these are totally superficial. I don't think this is the future of architecture at all. There are tools that have been developed, and some of my doctoral candidates are working on these. One of them is a world leader, and they work in a very different sort of way. And we're looking at performance questions, we're looking at data, automation, optimization, not just these superficial images. So I think they're utterly superficial, but there is something very interesting about them, which I'll mention later. But while I was working on this, I was kind of working on, and I felt compromised at one point, at the end of 2018, and I wrote to my publishers, and I said, I'm writing a book for you on AI, but I feel I'm both terrified, I'm both amazed by it, and I'm both terrified by it. And every day I'm more amazed and more terrified. So I wrote to them, I said, can I divide it up into two different books? One with a white cover, like The Angel, the good side of AI, and then one with a black cover, like The Devil, the dark side of AI, the Black Mirror episode of AI. And they agreed. So I'm doing that. And I had planned to put the black cover book off into the future, but it seems that the future is upon us sooner than we thought. So maybe I should be focusing on that. And just to be clear, there's nothing evil, I don't think, about this tool. It's just a tool, and like any other tool, it's a question of who uses it and for what. So I could use a kitchen knife and I cut my vegetables, but I could also murder you with it. And so far, no kitchen knife has been convicted of murder. It's a question of who's responsible. But nonetheless, it is so terrifyingly good at certain things that's where I think the dark side comes in, essentially coming out of the light side. Anyway, the second guy I should mention, Demis Lassabis. He was a chess prodigy. I think he studied natural sciences in Christ. Anyway, he graduated also from Cambridge, and he was interested in gaming. And then eventually founded a firm called DeepMind in London that eventually was bought up by Google. Very, very famous firm. And he got his Nobel Prize not for AI but for chemistry. And frankly, I think in the future most Nobel Prizes will probably have benefited from AI, and probably even Pritzker prizes too in the future. And of course, over history, there have been various moments when we've been our attention has been drawn to AI and its capabilities through high-profile events. Back in 1997, Gary Kasparov took on IBM's Deep Blue. Ray Kurzweil predicted by the year 2000 the world chess champion would be beaten by AI, but of course nobody thought that Gary Kasparov, who was one of the greatest chess players of all time, would be beaten by AI, but indeed he was. And the comment he makes afterwards, we just have to understand that everything we know how to do, machines will eventually do better than us, I think is very true, although not all at the same time. Chess is clearly very good at, and other things like catching a ball, these AI is not so good at. But anyway, that was actually quite easy for AI because they simply trained an expert system on all known games of chess, and that's on what it was based. But the next challenge, and the one that that DeepMind, the Demis Hassabis company, rose to, was the challenge of Go. Now, Go is, I don't know if anyone's played Go here, but it's a very straightforward game in terms of the potential moves. They're very simple moves, but infinitely complicated because there are more potential moves than there are atoms in the universe. And that means that even if you put all the computers in the world together, you simply didn't have enough computing power to do that. And they therefore had to shift from the expert systems of the past to the deep learning systems of the future. Anyway, in 2016, AlphaGo, the guy was just on the left is just moving it around for DeepMind, moving the stones around. And this is Lee Sedol, who was the kind of Gary Kasparov, shall we say, of the game of Go. And nobody thought that Lee Sedol, who was a complete genius, was going to lose to AI. But something happened in the match, and it took everyone by surprise. This is actually after game 2. There were 5 games, and after game 2, in other words, after game 1, he says, "Yesterday I was surprised, but today, the next day, after game 2, I am speechless." So something happened in game 2 that made him speechless, and it was basically this one move that is move 37 in game 2, unusually on the 5th line, so in the 4th or the 3rd early on in the match, and everybody thought it was a mistake, a computer glitch, and they were joking about it and whatever. But 100 moves later, this stone joined up with those 2 stones and won the match. It was as though AlphaGo was thinking 100 moves ahead. Well, AI doesn't think, but anyway, it was as though it was. And nobody realized. They all thought it was a computer glitch. So here are the commentators, and so you can hear what they're saying. There was no mistake. After the match, Lee Sedol made this comment. AlphaGo showed us that whose moves humans may have thought are creative were actually conventional. Well, I don't think that was the important thing. I think what was happening was AI was operating off the scale. In other words, those of you who've got dogs, you know that dogs can smell or hear a greater range of smells and sounds than we can. And I think this is what's happening with AI. It's simply beyond us. And as it gets better and better, we will be totally lost. There's a prediction by Mogwadet that by 2030, AI will have an IQ of 1,600. And we will be to AI roughly what an ant is to Einstein. That's the prediction. So we will have no clue what it's on about. And that itself is a little disturbing. But there was something else that happened that wasn't so. There's a documentary made about AlphaGo and it became very famous, but there was another, the next version, AlphaGo Zero, was even more impressive. It didn't really capture the headlines in the way it should have done. AlphaGo Zero beat AlphaGo 100 games to 0 playing Go, and that itself was remarkable. But the point was, it taught itself to play Go without being given the rules of Go. And how the hell do you do that? I don't know. But it taught itself to play Go by playing games of Go against itself using reinforcement learning. But then the other astonishing thing, or perhaps the most astonishing thing, was the rate at which it was playing games of Go. It played 3.9 million games of Go over 3 days. And you think, well, that's a lot, right? But if you think about it, that really is a lot. It's effectively 20 games of Go per second. Now this hopefully will start. This hummingbird will start. Well, it's not fluttering very well, but it's a slowed down video of a hummingbird beating its wings at 3 beats per second. Shame that. Oh, there we go. And just imagine 7 times that fast. Just imagine playing games of Go against yourself that fast. I don't think we were paying enough attention to this because this was truly astonishing. And what happened after that was maybe explained by this, because what happened after that was this. ChatGPT is not even 2 years old. It has its birthday on the 30th this month. What was interesting about ChatGPT was at the beginning of the month, OpenAI had not intended to release anything. They were working with GPT-4 at the time, but it was spewing out hate speech, and they didn't want to release it. But at the same time, they were aware their competitors were releasing things. And so midway through the month, the 15th of November, they thought, well, okay, let's just try this out. And they called it a low-key research review. They were just testing the market. They thought it was nothing special. Let's launch what they called a chatterbot. Then it's now known as a chatbot. And they launched it. And of course, everything exploded after that. And there were kind of jokes going around the office about the low-key research review that they'd just done. But this was hugely significant. This, I think, was the wake-up call. The AlphaGo match in Asia, in Go playing nations, has been called the Sputnik moment by Kai-Fu Lee, because that's when they realized how incredible AI was. The Sputnik course was, I think, 57. It's when the Soviets sent a satellite into space, and the Americans realized they were behind, and they founded NASA and ... I think this was the real Sputnik moment, when people began to realize how incredible AI could be. And of course, it is hallucinating. It's not perfect yet, but ChatGPT knows 10,000 times more than anyone in this room, and that's quite surprising. Even more surprising, in a way, was how these things worked. They were dependent on the transformer model that allowed them to kind of train them on vast amounts of data. But what was interesting about these things, they're called large language models, which doesn't sound very sexy, and it's actually a complete understatement, because they're not large, they're gigantic, they're enormous. They're trained on trillions of bits of information and billions of parameters. They are absolutely enormous, but strangely, they are computationally quite limited. They're only based on 200 lines of code. But what they started doing is producing these what are called emergent capabilities, or emergent abilities. They're able to do things they were not trained to do. They're able to translate languages. They're able to write code. And this got a bit alarming. What on earth's going on here? AI wasn't working very well to begin with, but now it's working better than we thought. What are we going to do about this? So this led to a letter that was issued by the Future of Life Institute, by Max Tegmark, MIT, and it basically say, please slow down until we know what the hell's going on. Please stop developing any of these models bigger than GPT-4. It was signed by Elon Musk. And of course, the chances of it working were zero. It's a bit like asking the leaders of the London Marathon to slow down. Of course they won't, because the competitors will catch up. And when you've got Google and Microsoft, at hammer and tongs competing, they're not going to slow down. So it proved to be absolutely a waste of time. But what was interesting was that Elon Musk then jumped ship and goes on to the other side. And he's now developing a supercomputer called the Colossus that is, never mind AGI, this is talking about superintelligence. So effectively, there's no constraint. It's as though we're on a runaway train with no brakes, getting faster and faster, and who knows what this is going to lead to. Anyway, Yuval Harari argues that this is actually quite dangerous, because it's hacked the operating system of human civilization, in that it's learned to write. And once you can write, you have enormous power. When he made this comment about 2 years ago, it didn't sound that they made much sense, but his recent comments are kind of terrifying in a way. This is talking about capture puzzles. It's terrifying. would argue that actually it's also hacked the operating system of architects in that it's learned how to design. And I don't know how many of you have been using these systems, but normally with a prompt for Midjourney, this is about 2 years old, this image almost now, with a prompt for Midjourney, I write about 70 words maybe, and it describes the lighting condition, the hyper-realistic detail, and so on and so on and so on. But the actual references to architecture are minimal. In this particular case, I think I said ultra-contemporary minimalist villa in the Austrian Alps. I didn't describe the Alps in the background, didn't describe the boulder in the foreground. I didn't describe what this building would look like or what it was made of. It was all done by Midjourney. Midjourney can effectively design, I think. Or this one, I just really asked for an ultra-contemporary stainless steel kitchen. I didn't specify the painting in the background, quite a nice painting, or the bushes, or the sculpts outside. It was all done by Midjourney. Or this, I don't know how long it would take an architect or a student to render this, but this was done in 3 seconds. Now, there's something even more alarming, I think, with the latest developments that have come through. This is Sora, which is the latest. Well, it hasn't been launched yet. It hasn't been released. It's by OpenAI, and it's based on a very, very similar principle to the large language models. Instead of tokens for words, it's patches for videos, but it's based on a huge quantity of data. And what is significant about this is that it can keep consistency, which is actually quite difficult for text to videos, for up to 60 seconds. And then it has an incredible detail resolution, as you'll see in a moment. We've had, there you go, we've had text to video since November 2022, but nothing like this. And this was really a kind of a revelation. But the other thing about it is it's also developing emergent capabilities, doing things that it was never trained to do. For example, there's a concept in computer science called occlusion. When something goes out of the frame and comes back into the frame again, that it was never trained to do. So this is some suburban riding a train in Tokyo, I guess, and you can see the background, these buildings, and then all of a sudden there's a reflection. We lose that image, but then it comes like now, and then it comes back, and it's able to do that. What I find more astonishing in a way is its grasp of 3D. This it's bird from Papua New Guinea. I mean, the resolution is pretty astonishing. But when it turns its head, you suddenly realize it has got a grasp of 3D that is mind-blowing. Just watch this. I mean, that is pretty incredible. And I've been talking about this all over the place, and I gave a talk at the University of Manchester. One of the faculty there said he'd been working on Sora and he'd been given access to it. And I said, oh, tell us all about it. He said, I can't, because under a non-disclosure agreement. And I said, well, instead of saying Sora is this or can do this, maybe you could use a different terminology. Maybe Sora might be able to do this. And basically, what he basically said was it's almost the grasp of 3D. It is trained on so much data, and if you can use photogrammetry to get to 3D, and we are almost at that point. Of course, architects would say, well, you do a bird, but it can't do a building. Not so. This is Sora doing an interior, not a very progressive or terribly interesting interior, but it's doing an interior. It's able to do it on a simple prompt. It will just do that interior, which is a little worrying in some ways. Now, we haven't got Sora yet. It's not been released, but there are other platforms such as Runway that you can use. And Runway, you're lucky if you get 10 seconds from it. But what you can do is kind of edit it and produce a kind of collage, and then put it onto Instagram, and it kind of syncs it up with the music, and it looks like it's intentionally as it is. So you can do this, for example, is an art gallery in Venice. Well, this is an interior of art galleries in Paris, meant to be, I think. You might not like this, but then you can put a different prompt in and get whatever it is that you want. What the prompt comes out, the video comes out based on the prompt. What's remarkable, it's only designed to produce videos, but we as architects can use it to design effectively. And it has this emerging capability of knowing what size humans should be in relation to the scale of the building. That's automatically all fed into it. So it's quite astonishing. And what you can also do is generate an image using Midjourney, and then take it into to Runway and produce an animation of that. So this is my these are my Mercedes-Benz, which you probably don't like either, but never mind. Here we go. So on. Okay, so back to Geoffrey Hinton. So Hinton, as I mentioned, had joined Google and was working on many of these projects, but then he stepped out of Google because he was alarmed by that. He had been the godfather who had given us deep learning, but was getting increasingly alarmed by the capabilities that it was displaying. So he was interviewed. I'll just play an interview with him. What's interesting about Geoffrey Hinton is that he has a background in neuroscience. So he doesn't just talk in vague terms about intelligence. Ray Kurzweil talk about intelligence, but he breaks it down into cognitive skills. Now, you might know something, you might know 10,000 times more. ChatGPT might know 10,000 times more than us, but that doesn't necessarily mean it understands it. And to understand something doesn't mean to say you can think, and to think doesn't mean to say you can engage in advanced reasoning. So he's looking at this in terms of these different stages. And I think he's absolutely spot on. Okay, here's it. Just to explain, he'd always said the litmus test was whether one of these chatbots could explain a joke. And because if you can explain a joke, you have to understand the joke. And the same goes for ChatGPT. Both he and Blaise Gariakos both believe that the quality of the answers show that actually it does understand the question. whether or not it can think, I mean, when I wrote my book, nobody thought that AI could think any more than a pocket calculator could think. So that's what I put in my book. And I would use the inverted commas to think or to learn or to understand. I'd use inverted commas for all of these things because it's a very different form of operating. In fact, elsewhere, Geoffrey Hinton says, well, it's not the same as human intelligence. It's not a biological form of intelligence. It's a mechanical form of intelligence. Very different, but it's potentially infinitely superior, partly because of its capacity to learn. And we've always used the model of Moore's law. Back in the 60s, Gordon Moore noticed that the number of transistors on a circuit board would double every 18 months, and the price would come down by half. So therefore, he developed this notion of exponential growth, which Ray Kurzweil applied to all technologies. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, he went 1, 2, 3, 8. Well, he's saying it's going to go 1, 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000, 1,000,000,000,000. I mean, I don't know what this means, but certainly in the UK, you used to have this thing during COVID where there was an R number, right? It was less than 1, good news. It wasn't spreading. More than 1, be worried. But what happens when the R number is 1,000? This is a little alarming. Anyway, this is just if you're not terrified enough, this is Yuval Harari talking. Okay. My suspicion, though, with Yuval Harari is that he's got a slight negative view towards this alien intelligence. You know, if you put it alongside the 2001: Space Odyssey, where the firstborns plant these monoliths to kind of help develop things. I mean, I think that's the way that it's going, frankly. So I don't necessarily have to assume they're going to be negative. But anyway, it's clear that they're very capable. I gave a talk in Warsaw last year, and of course, Nicholas Copernicus came from Poland, and he was famous for pointing out that the universe doesn't revolve around the Earth, rather than the Earth revolves around the sun. I think we have to go through a second Copernican revolution and recognize that we are not the center of intelligence in the universe. And our real problem is we've adopted an anthropocentric viewpoint so far. We've looked down on AI and said, oh, it doesn't have consciousness, it's not self-aware, it's not sentient. Well, what would AI think of us if it could think? I mean, you probably think those idiots. It takes 10,000 times less than me. They're so slow and whatever. And I think we've got to put this in perspective. I'm not even sure that we need to worry about consciousness. I know that's a very controversial viewpoint, but I mean, going back to Blaze's point, you know, as long as it works, who cares? If my toaster makes good toast, I don't care if it's conscious. If AI is generating good designs, I don't care if it's conscious. In fact, we could even claim, and there's a lot of debate about this, famously, John Searle criticized Alan Turing, the Turing tests, and say, well, it might appear as though it's conscious, but it's not. But I would even twist that around and take the work of Daniel Dennett, who says, well, maybe consciousness is just an illusion, and say, well, maybe actually really what is going on is just what that guy inside that room is doing. He's kind of following instructions and translating Chinese. He doesn't know a word of Chinese, but on the outside, they think he's speaking Chinese. And that's the critique of the Turing test. It might appear as though it's conscious, but it's not. But what is consciousness? Maybe it's just, and it's always referred to by neuroscientists as an inner movie. Is it simply an attempt to make sense of what we're doing, of narrating our lives and giving meaning into it? That's a provocative statement. I won't go too down that part of the way, but I think we could even see that consciousness itself is some kind of illusion. But now I get into the slightly Black Mirror, or the very Black Mirror episode bit, and that is that we made two mistakes, I think, in the past. First of all, we thought it would be the blue-collar workers who would be out of jobs first. We've seen these pictures of Tesla factories, not a person in sight, and we thought, well, it's going to be them, right? The architects will be safe. You know, the engineers, the lawyers, the doctors will all be safe, and the computer scientists, right? Well, actually, the problem about robots, apart from they're very expensive, is that when you take them out of a controlled environment, they don't perform so well. If I were to put a robotic arm on this desk, it would be able to stack up a wall of Lego bricks with about the skill of an 18-month kid. Very, very clumsy. Meanwhile, AI has been racing ahead, and it's learned to code. So even the computer scientists are worried that their jobs are at risk. That's the first problem. And it's called, we call this Moravec's principle, in the sense that that we can do things that AI can't do. We can catch balls. They're very tricky for a robot to do that, but it can do things that we can't do. Hence, ChatGPT can know 10,000 times more than we can. The other problem, in some senses, is this. This is well, it's a very crude graph, but it's based on, I think, the latest research that's come out looking at the impact of AI, in the sense that it enhances what we can do. This is research done by sociologists from MIT and Harvard, and they took a sample group and they tested them out, and they discovered, this is probably the most important image I'm going to show you today. They discovered that the use of AI would improve not just the quality, but also the quantity and the speed by roughly 40 to 50%. So in effect, we can't do without this. You know, we can't be competitive unless we use it. Just as we need to use spell check, we need to use calculators. We cannot use AI without this. This has led to this kind of comment. I don't know if you've seen this. It drives me crazy. It's all over the place. AI won't replace humans, but humans with AI will replace those without AI. This is very misleading. Very, very misleading, because it assumes there's a one-for-one correlation, that one person using AI will replace one person not using AI. But when we look at this, we know that one person using AI can achieve substantially more than someone not using AI. And that's based on existing technology. So the real one is going to be something like this. AI won't replace humans, but 3 humans with AI will replace 5 humans without AI. You can't really generalize for architecture because there's so many different tasks involved in architecture, but this is the direction we're going. And as the technology gets more powerful, inevitably, there will be job losses. The offices will shrink. That's fairly clear. And the real problem is this. This is my friend Guven Shosel, who teaches at UCLA. He's got a 4-person practice, and they're competing with Gensler and all these big guys in competitions. They're almost winning these competitions, and very soon they will be winning them against these big firms. Now, they could cut their fees. I mean, say cut their fees from 5 to 2%, 5% to 2%, and they would still make a profit. There's 4 of them. They could still make a profit. But the real problem at architecture is that is the total sum of money coming into the profession is based on that. There will be no more buildings. So if you reduce the fees by 40%, you will reduce the amount of money going into the profession. And the real risk of that is that you will go the way of China. Now, for different reasons, people are not studying architecture in China. They've discovered it's not well paid, and they're just going into other disciplines. Design is popular, but not architecture. In the old days, it'd be very, very hard to get a place at Tongji or Tsinghua or whatever. Now it's very easy. The cultural capital of architecture has evaporated, and that's the real risk. This could lead to something quite pernicious. The death of the architect was already being proclaimed by FAT some time ago in 2015. Before AI came onto the scene, their view was somehow architecture has lost whatever it is. I don't know exactly what it is, but certainly that's their comments. Years ago, I was working on this with Joseph Rykwert, for Joseph Rykwert, who's just died 2 weeks ago, tragically. And this was actually, I got to say, this is the point where I really picked up on computation, because in those days we didn't have laptops. I typed everything up on the mainframe computer in the computer science department above the Babbage Lecture Theatre. Of course, Charles Babbage was crucial in the history of computation. And I was surrounded by these absolute geeks with no social skills, but doing the most astonishing things. And once more, when I was translating it, I realized that actually computation could do things. Like Joseph gave me a 2-volume edition. So based the translation on that. I mean, it was doing postmodernism, so style was kind of a big thing, right? But I didn't follow that. What I discovered before that, you were typing things on a typewriter and tipexing things out, right? And that's it. You couldn't afford to do more. But with a computer, you would revise it, and a very precise, pithy form of language came out. So it was very clear to me at that time that and we were just beginning to get into CAD and so on, that computation was going to completely transform architecture itself. But what is interesting is that Alberti is the person who gave us the definition of the architect that we have today. Somewhere around 1450, he makes this comment. Have I got time to? Okay. But he's translated. But before I go any further, I feel I should explain whom I would have you consider the architect. Non insignarium it's not a carpenter whom you should compare to the best men of the other arts. The carpenter, the hand of the carpenter is for the architect as an instrument. And then he goes on to describe how the architect is the person in charge. He's in charge of everything. And that was the crucial point. They shifted the definition of architecture, which they thought was Latin, based on arcus and tectum, the arch and the covering, and the carpenter, especially because the carpenter was making the vaults, and Joseph was the carpenter, and so on, and blah, 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 to the Latin, to the Greek. It was the chief builder. It was the architect who was in charge. Well, that definition has already been eroded. This is the Building Futures group, which I used to be part of, the RBA, and they released this and they took it back again. First of all, there's some architects saying we don't want to use the term architect because it doesn't really help us anymore because we're doing so many other things. But in this report, they also point out that architects are no longer in charge. More than 50% of contracts are design build contracts where you're working for a developer. So things are already happening. The architecture is already, in some sense, been eroded. So the title of the Black Book, which might not be the title, and it's not about necessarily, it's the demise of the architect profession in the age of AI. It's not just AI, it's other factors that are feeding into it. And maybe what we're going to see being reborn is a different kind of architect, maybe a different word even used for the term architect. But it seems to me that this is the threat that is around there right now. So I was asked to give a lecture on Halloween. So I took the opportunity to go on to Midjourney and Runway and produce a requiem for the architect, super gloomy thing for Halloween. Here we go. The fact that I could do that in half an hour is terrifying too. So I think filmmakers should start working, but don't panic. So this is where we have a happy ending to this movie, okay? Don't panic. I'm sure, like many of you, you were brought up with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This is in the back cover. Something by Douglas Adams. He was also a Cambridge graduate. He was at St John's College, I think you probably, some of you may remember the famous story. They build a supercomputer. It takes 7.5 million years to come up with the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. And it comes up with 42, right? And they thought, what the hell? And then he said, well, it would be good if you'd phrase your question more precisely. And this, for Elon Musk, is a book about philosophy, because in engineering, you've got to get the question right. And I think Tom Main also talks about how, as an architect, you've got to get what is the question? Do you want to get the design right? You've got to know the question. Anyway, then they then build another supercomputer that happens to be the Earth, and it's going to take 10 million years to come up with the question for the answer, the meaning of the life and everything. Except it doesn't quite get there because the Vogon fleet destroys the Earth to create a superhighway. But what's interesting about this is that the work that Blaise has been doing with his group at Google is basically saying that life is computational. So if the Earth, so the idea that the Earth could be a computer is maybe not so far wrong. Of course, Elon Musk was influenced by this in other ways. That you probably noticed when he sent his Tesla car to space, you can see the word "Don't panic" on the dashboard there, which is a clear reference to that. And also, I guess Blade Runner. Maybe just play. I love this piece. I'll just bring this piece. Rutger Hauer was born in 1944 in the Netherlands, same year as William Cornell. And what interesting he says about the movie, it's not a movie about replicants, it's a movie about what it is to be a human being. And over again, I find that with AI. AI becomes a mirror in which you can begin to understand what it is to be a human being. And of course, the car that was used there was it somehow influenced the Cybertruck that was released on the 19th of November 2021. Is that right? Which was when Blade Runner was set. Interestingly, the day before that was when COVID was discovered. Replicants, COVID, difficult to discover, whatever, potentially lethal, and so on. Also, Eldon Tyrell. Remove the D, you've got Elon, right? Okay. The other one, I just mentioned this briefly. I don't know if I can. This is. I'm going to skip this, but this is basically, for the sake of time, this is Elon Musk referring to Arthur C. Clarke. It seems not only is he actually evoking these things, he's actually following science fiction, which makes it even more weird in terms of what we do. So I'm going to skip this. I'm going to finish with this guy, Arthur C. Clarke, who was behind 2001: A Space Odyssey. Truly astonishing figure. This was recorded in 1963, 60 years ago. And it's as though he was talking about the same things that Geoffrey Hinton was talking about. So here's Arthur C. Clarke. What is going to save us is this. Human beings are infinitely adaptive creatures. I wrote about this in my book, Camouflage. We adapt to everything. In fact, we probably can't even remember what it was like before we had these things. You know, how do we get around? We have things like A to Z of London, right? And we move on, we adapt, and things become our new normal. In the future, things will be different. We will have amazing scientific developments, no question. AlphaFold and so on will have incredible scientific developments. Offices will shrink. Offices will shrink. There's no two ways about it. They will shrink. It'll be different. But we will get used to it. It'll become our new normal, and we'll almost forget what it was like in 2024. It'll be different. If I were to give you one example to illustrate that, if 50 years ago, when I was a kid running around, someone had said to me, in 50 years' time, most marriages would end in divorce. I would think, oh my God, it's the end of the world. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? Well, most marriages do end in divorce, and we're quite okay with that. And we will be quite okay with our new normal. So I'm going to finish on a very British note. Keep calm and carry on. Thank you.